Well, hello there, I'm back again with another build video, and this time around I'm making a totally new style of softbait for me that has a so-called shudder tail. So without further ado, let's get started. For this project I'm using a brand new material for me called OBOmodulan that I will use to carve the softbait master. And honestly, it's pretty nice stuff and has a consistency of maybe basswood or maybe linwood. So special thanks to my Facebook buddy that got me this new material. Thanks a lot, bro. So, since this OBOmodulan I got comes as a pretty thick board, I needed to saw off a little bit from it to make it a little bit more usable for me. And since this material is not too hard to work with, it's pretty easy to just use normal hand tools, which is more than fine by me. So naturally after the splitting I needed to sand the sawed off surfaces, and once again my new sander came pretty handy here. When I got the sides nice and smooth, I decided to take off the excess from the side profile with my trusty rasp, and then just smooth everything down with a sander. After I got everything nice and smooth, it was time to do some more sawing. But before that, I needed to mark where I need to cut, so this template came pretty handy. After the sawing, well, you guessed it, time to do some serious sanding again. Like always, I tend to drill the eye sockets before I start the actual body shaping. Just makes aligning the eyes a little bit easier if I do it now. Now, since this new material does not have any grain like wood does, it seems to be really easy to carve when you don't have to worry about chipping. I really like that. Makes my life a little bit easier for sure. So before I can start to carve this thing, I needed to make a template for the head details so that it would be easy to transfer the details to both sides of my master. When I got all of the guidelines drawn into the master, I get to start my favorite thing to do, and that is to make this thing come alive. Oh, and I get this question a lot, what kind of a knife I use. And my main knife for carving small details is a Tejima LC 360 hobby knife with those nifty rechangeable blades, which I find to be really handy when you can just broke off a piece and you have a sharp blade again. And yes, I am that lazy. Once I had got along those guidelines, I started to bring out the details. Not really sure if I've mentioned this in my previous carving related videos, but I try to use my both hands in unison when I do this carving. I tend not to move my hand that is holding the knife that much. Rather, I'm using the other hand to push the bait towards the blade, thus making the actual carving economical in quotations. You sort of like want to do less as possible to make it happen, if that makes any sense. After I finished carving the head details, I needed to sand everything smooth as a baby's butt. For this I used sanding paper in the grit 100 and 240. So before I could start doing anything on the tail, I needed to mark the center line so that making it symmetrical would be more accurate than just eyeballing it later on. I made this little template for the shape of the tail and used that to give me some guidelines before I could start shaping anything. After I marked where I wanted the borders to be, I whipped out my fake Dremel tool and started to shape the tail. I figured it would be a pretty dusty business, so I figured it would be a sensible thing to hook up a hoover next to it to suck off most of the dust. When I was happy with the shape of my tail, I needed to fit it to the rest of the body. And what better way to do it than just to drill some pilot holes and just finish it off with a knife. I figured that after the tail fitting I would do all of the fins, and since this new material is pretty easy to carve, I had to take extra care not to cut too deep here, which ended up being a pretty easy task. Since my previous project, I really fell in love with this freeline way of making the grid pattern that I would then use to align the scales. With this method I can control the size of the scales in relation to where they're located on the master. It makes everything look a little bit more realistic when you do it this way. Or at least that's what I think. So after all of that drawing, it's time to carve out the scales. And you can really see well how nicely the size difference on the scales is easy to control depending where they're located with this freelining method that I use. Like, usually the scales on the head area and the back are smaller on a real fish. Once I had all of the scales carved, I did the lateral line, just to add that little extra realism to my bait. It's pretty straightforward stuff really. I used again a stencil to mark what the lateral line would be, and just use a tip of a knife to punch in some holes to imitate the lateral line. Finally, after absolutely everything was carved on my master, it was time to put this mini sculpture together and glue in all of the fins and the tail. once everything was tidied up on my master, it was time again to start working on the two-piece mold. And in case you're wondering, the grey stuff is Le Bon Touché modeling clay that you can reuse over and over again. This is really great stuff, and it seems to work well with me at least. When I had excavated the hole to fit half of a master in, it was just a matter of making sure that the potting line was straight and clean as possible. You know, the better you make it here, the less flashing or overflow you will get later on when you actually pour the soft plastics. Now that the half of the master was sealed into the modeling clay and I had added some locator holes, it was just a matter of mixing some Mold Max 30 and pouring that into my mold. And like in my mold making video that's actually blocked in some countries, I always pour a skin of Mold Max onto the master and maybe give it 10 minutes to settle, and that's usually enough time for all of the bubbles to burst. And I have a bubble-free mold without having to force to use a vacuum pot. I had a bunch of old molds lying around, so I decided to chop those up and add the pieces to the rest of the silicone to add more volume and get rid of those old molds that I don't use anymore. A real win-win situation. When the silicone was cured, I could remove the modeling clay and start working on the other half. And it seems to be a pretty good idea to remove the Lego pieces so that it's easier to pull off the modeling clay. Something I did not do on my original mold making tutorial. And I've been kicking myself ever since. So I decided to skip the making of the other half because it's exactly the same as the first half. But I must say this is my favorite part of the mold making process. It's always so cool to open up a brand new mold. Speaking of exciting and cool stuff, it's always exciting to do the first pours and work out any problems you might have with a new mold. Luckily, there were virtually no problems with this mold and everything came out pretty well on the first pour. The original idea I had with this project was to make this soft bait resemble a golden shiner, and that is exactly the color pattern I will be painting this new bait in. And as always, I'm still using the cap coatings of plastic paints. I could not figure out a better way to make the pectoral fins come away from the body itself, so I decided to make them separately and simply glue them into the soft plastic. And honestly, this seems to work pretty well. Since it's winter in Finland right now, I was lucky enough to find a little stretch of open water to film the action of my new bait. By the way, funny story, I actually fell through the ice 2 times while walking to this spot. It was pretty refreshing to say the least. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed watching me build this thing as much as I enjoyed making it. So I guess that's all from me now. Catch you guys later.